Judiciary Committee will please come to order, a quorum being present. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. Pursuant to Committee Rule 2 and House Rule 11, Clause 2, the Chair may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote for the ayes and nays are ordered. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3942, the Preventing Online Sales of Cigarettes to Children Act, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 3942, to apply requirements related to...
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 3942, the Preventing Online Sale of E-Cigarettes to Children Act, seeks to address a growing threat to the health of our young people, the use of e-cigarettes, which can be purchased by minors over the internet with little or no regulation, I should say. This past summer, the country learned about hundreds of cases in which patients, often youthful, previously healthy adults, showed up in emergency rooms suddenly stricken with dangerous respiratory damage. As of the beginning of this month, 1,080 lung injury cases associated with the use of e-cigarettes or vaping products have been reported to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. This problem is widespread, with cases having been reported in 48 states and 1 U.S. territory. At least 18 deaths linked to these products have been confirmed in 15 states. As we confront the growing danger presented by e-cigarettes, we should begin by limiting access to these products by young people who face the greatest risk from their use. This legislation would close a loophole in the statute that regulates the delivery sale of conventional cigarettes to minors by extending it to cover e-cigarettes as well. In 2010, the Prevent All Cigarette Trafficking Act, known also as the PACT Act, was signed into law. This important legislation, including a strong age verification provision to prevent online sales of cigarettes to minors by requiring sellers to use a method of shipment that includes a signature and photo ID check upon delivery. The national standard put in place by the PACT Act has ensured that the internet is not used to evade the type of ID checks required at grocery and convenience stores where tobacco products are sold. But the market for tobacco products has changed dramatically since we enacted the PACT Act almost 10 years ago. Since 2014, e-cigarettes have risen to become the most commonly used tobacco product among young people. And the Surgeon General has concluded that e-cigarettes among youth and young adults is a public health concern. Numerous studies have found that exposure to nicotine during adolescence can cause addiction and can harm the developing adolescent brain. Alarmingly, the 2018 National Youth Tobacco Survey found a dramatic surge in the use of e-cigarettes by youth between 2017 and 2018. A 78% increase in use among high school students and a 48% increase in use among middle school students. This was in just 1 year. And its use among young people is expected to grow even further if we do not take action. Data from the CDC, the Food and Drug Administration, and the National Institutes of Health suggests that an overwhelming majority of young people who use e-cigarettes do not get them from retail establishments. Many get them through the internet. Therefore, we must do everything we can to close the source of supply of a product that is endangering the health of our communities, and particularly the health of the children in our communities. H.R. 3942 would expand the definition of the term cigarette in the PACT Act to also include an electronic nicotine delivery system. The bill would limit the ability of minors to obtain via the internet not only e-cigarettes, but also e-hookahs, e-cigars, vape pens, advanced refillable personal vaporizers, electronic pipes, and components of any of these. The legislation takes the first step toward curbing the use of e-cigarettes by young people. I applaud Representative Rosa DeLauro for authoring this important legislation. I urge all my colleagues to support H.R. 3942. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your summary of the bill. I agree with you on this bill. H.R. 3942 needs to be approved. I'm a co-sponsor. I look forward to approving this and yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. Are there any amendments to H.R. 3942? Gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
I would just move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I'm proud to co-sponsor H.R. 3942, and I wholeheartedly support this legislation and all efforts to curb youth vaping. In the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we have seen an explosion in the use of nicotine and THC-based vaping products. Just 2 weeks ago in my district, a 19-year-old young man was placed into a medically induced coma for a severe lung illness related to nicotine-based vaping addiction. Stories like this are becoming more and more common as the e-cigarette industry embraces methods to appeal to more and more people, and particularly children. The explosion of flavored e-tobacco products and the lack of regulation has allowed this problem to create a widespread public health problem. HR 3942 is a great first step towards ensuring that we're ending the targeting of children and teens by the tobacco industry, but it's important that it not be our only step. We must also look at measures that ban flavoring of nicotine products writ large. In my district, tobacco companies have been targeting marketing to children of flavored cigar products and targeting neighborhoods of color. So I look forward to passage of this act and additional acts to end the targeting of children. Thank you.
Are there any further amendments? For what purposes, gentlemen?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
No, the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that this letter from the National Association of Convenience Stores be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Congresswoman DeLauro and my good friend Kelly Armstrong for introducing the Preventing Online Sales of E-Cigarettes to Children's Act. This is a critical effort to improve the health of our nation's teenagers, and their bipartisan work is commendable. Teen e-cigarette use has more than doubled since 2017. This is particularly concerning given the recent outbreak of lung injuries associated with e-cigarettes and vaping. As of last week, there were roughly 1,300 lung injury cases and 26 confirmed deaths, including one in my home state of Pennsylvania, which my colleague just referenced. In 2010, Congress passed the PACT Act to address the concerns about internet sales of cigarettes. The PACT Act required internet sellers of cigarettes to verify the age of the purchaser upon delivery and require internet cigarette retailers to collect and remit state and local sales taxes. It only makes sense that we apply the same rules to e-cigarettes. We can significantly cut down on youth access and address illicit online sales without affecting the law-abiding adults who use these products. Again, I'd like to commend Representatives DeLauro and Armstrong for introducing this critical bill, and I would urge my colleagues to support this act. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purposes, gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a co-sponsor of H.R. 3942, the Preventing Online Sales of E-Cigarettes to Children's Act, and I'm pleased that the committee is considering this important bill today. I join in applauding the gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro, for taking the lead on this issue and for introducing this bipartisan legislation. As my colleagues before me have described, this bill is designed to address a very serious public health crisis in our country, one which tragically is affecting our children. I'm obviously concerned about our children because what I believe the industry is doing is they are recruiting and developing a new generation of smokers, because otherwise, why would you have e-liquids that are fruit, bubble gum, or even cotton candy flavors? I think the whole vaping industry is interesting because it seems to me that it is a new way that the tobacco industry has found to bypass restrictions that were imposed many years ago. For example, the tobacco industry agreed not to market products to children. The tobacco industry was essentially kicked off of TV in terms of TV advertising, and now we see they have found another way to increase the number of people that smoke. California was on the front lines of restricting smoking, and the world was supposed to end, businesses were going to go under, everything was going to happen. And what has happened, though, is that smoking has gone down dramatically in the state of California and around the country. And I think that what is happening with e-cigarettes is just another way to come at promoting addiction. So I support this legislation and believe it will play an important role in addressing the crisis. In 2010, Congress extended the Jenkins Act to regulate the delivery sales of tobacco products over the internet through the Prevent All Cigarette Trafficking Act, or PACT. Among other things, the PAC curbed internet sales of cigarettes to underage people by requiring that delivery agents check identification in person in the delivery of the product. H.R. 3942 amends current law to curb the online sales of e-cigarettes to minors. Amending current law to extend these protections is the right thing to do, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill. In addition, because I might not be present when we consider H.R. 886, the Veteran Treatment Court Coordination Act, I also want to now express my support for that bill. This is a bipartisan bill that reinforces Congress's commitment to justice-involved veterans by establishing the Veteran Treatment Court Program Office in the DOJ. We would make permanent our support for the hundreds of local veteran treatment court programs around the country that successfully rehabilitate veterans. Los Angeles County currently operates 5 veteran treatment courts. These veterans programs are a collaborative effort between the court, the Department of Veteran Affairs, the Public Defender, and the Department of Mental Health in our county. And like veterans courts across the country, the LA County program requires a nexus between the alleged crime and the veteran's military service and seeks to address the underlying causes that led to the crime. The LA program's rehabilitative program is robust and rigorous, and justice-involved veterans charged with a felony or serious misdemeanor undertake a minimum 18-month intensive treatment program. While it's not unique to Los Angeles veteran courts programs, one element of my hometown program deserves particular attention. The Los Angeles courts have established a partnership with community organizations that support veterans during and after the formal court program. These organizations are many, and for so many veterans court participants, the community partners provide a low-cost or no-cost network for veteran court participants and provide long-term post-program support. I'm proud to support these local important efforts, and I support this bill and will assist those programs around the country. And I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting the bill.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Sir Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the timely markup of H.R. 3942. And I also appreciate my colleague, Congresswoman DeLauro, for introducing this bipartisan piece of legislation, of which I am an original co-sponsor. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, about 3 million high school students used e-cigarettes last year. That's a 78% increase since 2017. And as the number of children and teenagers using e-cigarettes increases, I'm very concerned about the accessibility of these products online. And by requiring in-person age verification upon delivery of online purchases of e-cigarette products, the bill will help curb or address the purchase and use of e-cigarettes by minors. Again, I thank the gentlewoman for introducing this legislation, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding such an important markup today. And I also want to thank Representative DeLauro for introducing this bill and supporting this issue. The spread of e-cigarettes is a public health crisis. Between 2017 and 2019, e-cigarette use has increased by 135% among high school students. Now more than 25% of high school students vape or use e-cigarettes. This epidemic is even reaching younger children. We know there are reports that children as young as 12 years old are vaping, and several deaths have been linked to the use of e-cigarettes. This causes great harm, and it affects brain development. In my home state of Florida alone, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids estimates that approximately 5,600 children under the age of 18 become new daily smokers each year. After years of anti-smoking campaign, e-cigarettes are blamed for the increase in tobacco use. And I think that as adults, we understand that using e-cigarettes at a young age is dangerous. It makes it much more likely that these kids will use tobacco for the rest of their lives. For years now, e-cigarette companies have gotten off very easily with absolutely no consequence. They have been marketing directly to our children with flavors like gummy bear, fruity cereal, and cotton candy. They are clearly marketing and aimed at kids to make these products also readily available online. They can be easily purchased online without any real verification that the person buying the e-cigarette is over the age of 18. As a mom, believe me, I have been advocating to end this practice. We have the power here in Congress to do everything we can to keep our children safe and keep these addictive and dangerous items out of the hand of our children. That's why the bill that we're marking up today is so important. We have to close these loopholes that allow children to get e-cigarettes with just a few clicks. Requiring online and in-person verification for e-cigarettes is critical to keeping the nicotine out of the hands of our children. I strongly support H.R. 3942. We must protect the health of our nation's children. We have to stop the next generation of kids from getting addicted to tobacco, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purposes? Gentlelady from Arizona seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very happy that we're working on some bipartisan bills today that the American public really cares about. And every time I watch TV and see some of these young people that are in the hospital, I think I saw one just the other night that had breathing tubes connected to her, and her mother was crying. The e-cigarette epidemic is really a problem, and so I'm very happy to support H.R. 3942 in preventing online sales of e-cigarettes. I think the American people will be happy with us that we're passing that, and I hope the Senate passes it too. And just moving on to the next bill, H.R. 886, I have 70,000 veterans that live in my district, so having a Veteran Treatment Court Coordination Act is very important to my veterans, and I support that bill too. And I yield back my time.
Gentlelady yields back. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 3942 favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit their views. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 886, the Veteran Treatment Court Coordination Act of 2019 for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 886, to direct the Attorney General to establish and carry out a Veteran Treatment Court program.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 886, the Veteran Court Coordination Act, is bipartisan legislation that would help fulfill our responsibilities to this nation's veterans, particularly those who have service-connected mental health disabilities and who have become involved in the criminal justice system. It would establish a Veterans Treatment Court Program Office in the Department of Justice to support the hundreds of local Veterans Treatment Court programs around the country that successfully rehabilitate veterans, providing services tailored to their unique needs. Veterans Treatment Courts allow veterans charged with certain crimes attributed to physical or mental issues connected with their military service to receive court-supervised comprehensive treatment provided by the Department of Veterans Affairs and community organizations. For its part, the VA provides specialized support to veteran courts by providing services and a trained consultant who serves on the Veterans Court treatment team, coordinates the provision of health care services, answers questions posed by the court, and assists the legal teams. The VA specialist matches the defendant veteran to programs that may assist the veteran on the road to recovery, which in the majority of cases starts with substance abuse or mental health treatment. In recent years, the VA has expanded the number of treatment options that are available to Veterans Court participants, which now include mentoring, mental health counseling, substance abuse treatment, housing services, and vocational counseling. Veteran defendants who successfully complete Veteran Court programs can avoid jail time, receive needed treatment, and have their records expunged. Despite efforts to welcome veterans home and to ease their transition to civilian life, many veterans continue to face hardships after completing their military service. One study reports that approximately 9% of veterans who served in Iraq and Afghanistan have been arrested since returning home. The Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that approximately 180,000 veterans were incarcerated in state and federal prisons between 2011 and 12. Of those incarcerated veterans surveyed, 48% of veterans in prison and 55% of veterans in jail reported that they had been told by a mental health professional that they had a mental health disorder. Veterans Treatment Courts provide an effective means by which communities can rehabilitate veterans who commit crimes and may support those who have been impacted by the crime by ensuring victims receive restitution. Although 20% of Veterans Court participants received jail sanctions during their participation in the Veteran Courts program, only 14% experienced a new incarceration during an average of nearly 1 year in the program. This recidivism rate is substantially less than the 23 to 46% one-year recidivism rate found among non-veteran prisoners. Most programs reported less than 5 dropouts in the 2017 calendar year. There are over 500 Veterans Treatment Courts operated by state, local, and tribal governments nationwide. The Veterans Treatment Court Program Office established by this bill would build upon the success by standardizing data reporting methods, serving as a repository for resources, providing training to Veterans Courts administrators, and distributing information nationwide regarding best practices on how to improve the administration of Veterans Courts. Currently, there are roughly 21 million veterans of the United States Armed Forces who have risked their lives in service of this country. Many of these men and women served on battlefields during the Second World War and wars in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. This bill would help provide support to more than 1 million veterans diagnosed with service-connected disabilities, as well as the thousands who are undiagnosed, who have been and will be exposed to the criminal justice system. Supporting rehabilitative support programs like Veterans Courts is the least we can do to acknowledge their sacrifice and treat our veterans involved with the criminal justice system with compassion and care. The bill ensures that existing Veterans Court programs will continue their mission to serve our veterans and make it easier for jurisdictions to start new veteran court programs and adopt best practices. I thank our colleague, Representative Charlie Crist, for his leadership in authoring H.R. 886 and his continued dedication to supporting our veterans. I support this legislation and urge its quick adoption by the committee today. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be submitting a statement for the record, but I will say, as a current member of the military and the Air Force, a veteran of Iraq as well, this is something that I have seen work. It is something that I'm glad to see us taking up. My home county of Hall actually has a veterans court. It is working well. Judge Roberts has set a standard here. I think this is something we need to be doing more of. I would like to see this continue, and it is something we need to put forward and fund, because not only does it work on recidivism, it also takes care and takes the special needs of those who have served in our military as they come forward and helpful in that. So I would encourage a strong vote and get it done.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. The gentlelady, for what purpose is the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Chairman, I'm so grateful that we're having this markup on this bill. I'm a proud co-sponsor. El Paso, Texas is home to Fort Bliss, which is one of the key assets in for our military. One of the things that we've seen happen in my community is as we have veterans who are returning home, many times because of deficiencies at the federal level or because of lack of funding at the federal level, the local property taxpayer, the local community ends up taking up the charge of caring for our veterans in some cases. And the specialty courts, whether you're a veteran or not, as the ranking member mentioned, have shown to work. They are very successful. I'm a strong supporter of this program, of this grant program, and would urge my colleagues to support as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and as a member of Congress who represents a district that has among the highest concentration of veterans, I'm very grateful to the bipartisan leadership that has brought this bill forward. And this legislation demonstrates how our great federalist system works best. States across our great country have established veterans courts. They've reduced recidivism. They've acknowledged the unique experience that folks who serve in our military have and the unique challenges that can present when they interact with the criminal justice system. In Florida, I was honored to be one of the sponsors of the legislation that set up veterans court pilot programs and that ultimately set up veteran courts statewide. I want to specifically thank a judge from my district, Judge T. Patterson Maney, who wore the uniform, who went downrange, who was awarded a Purple Heart and then came back to my district to make as his mission in life service to our veterans and the establishment of these veterans courts. And now that our states have done the right thing, they've innovated, they've developed winning strategies to reduce recidivism, it is only appropriate that here in the Congress we would recognize the federal government's role in continuing to care for our veterans. As we look across the recruitment spectrum, and this is work I do on the Armed Services Committee, we continue to see that we have a lot to do to recruit excellent young patriots into military service. And the more we're able to care for our veterans, the more we're able to establish a specialized experience as veterans interact with different elements of the government, the more I think we're able to make that an attractive life choice for people. I would be remiss, though, if in the conversation about the unique experience of veterans, we did not recognize the unique toll that is placed on military communities and on military families when our nation engages in endless, unfocused, unconstitutional, undeclared wars. And I know we've got a number of members on this committee, namely Mr. Buck of Colorado and others, who have tried to reestablish the Congress's role in declaring war. And it's my hope that just as we've made bipartisan progress on this work for our veterans, that we will continue to honor their service by stepping up and doing our job and making sure that we're not sending the bravest, best Americans downrange in the absence of having a vote, having an open debate, and declaring war when necessary. The blood of our bravest patriots is America's most sacred currency, and it should only be spent when absolutely necessary. I thank my colleagues for their work on this bill, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman, for what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, speak in support of H.R. 886, the Veteran Treatment Court Coordination Act of 2019. We've seen in Pennsylvania and in my district in particular, in Montgomery County, the effectiveness of veterans treatment courts and statewide, frankly, in Pennsylvania. So I give credit to the judges who came up with these somewhat pilot programs to provide resources for vets who are charged with nonviolent crimes, including providing counseling and support services to transition into civilian life. What this bill does that is so worthy is it will permanently establish a grant program office in the Department of Justice to administer these veteran court grants and award them to state governments. It's a common sense bipartisan bill that will help our veterans get the necessary resources they need and they deserve. I thank Rep. Chris for introducing it. I'm so pleased to support this bill, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Yield?
I will. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. I just want to add, likewise, my appreciation to the chairpersons and ranking members of the committee. I have a very large number of veterans in the state of Texas and in the 18th Congressional District. We have the Veterans Hospital, Veterans Affairs. We face a lot of exposure as it relates to veterans who are homeless. Many of them, because they have run into the wrong side of the law because of experiences that they've had in war or in the service. And I've found that the veterans courts having a particular sensitivity to the service that has been rendered, but also to the predicament that these veterans may find themselves in, provides a whole new door of opportunity for rescue, recovery, restoration. Although they have committed a crime and there is the attempt to find the right kind of punishment because they're not above the law, it is a recognition that they put on the uniform unselfishly and that they serve this nation, and how best can we provide a justice system that allows for them to have restoration. This is an excellent idea, and I appreciate the fact that we in the federal government are giving an additional hand of affirmation of this system, and I congratulate the sponsors of this legislation. I thank the gentlelady for yielding, and I yield back to the gentlelady. Or I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition?
Sure.
Gentleman from California. For what purpose does the gentleman seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I am very sympathetic of the objective of this bill and of the, and certainly recognize the unique sacrifices that our veterans make. But I hope that someone can explain to me how this concept of a separate court for veterans comports with our fundamental concepts of equal justice under law. I mean, any judge and any jury will take into account the unique circumstances of a veteran defendant, but operating different courts for different classes of defendants, I'm afraid, starts us down a slippery slope, and I'm hoping one of the proponents can disabuse me of this concern. I mean, are we in the future going to have women's courts or first responder courts or transgender courts? Equal justice under law is a bedrock principle of a free society, and I am concerned that this is a precedent that will undermine that bedrock of our judicial system.
Gentlemen yield back.
I'll be happy to yield to anyone who can address this question. I guess not. I yield back.
Well, Mr. Chairman.
The lady from Texas.
To the gentleman, let me, I don't know in the future what we'll be hearing about first responders or women courts, but I think you have a very relevant question. I can tell you how it has been utilized. There's something about the impact of war on these veterans that a court that has the immediate tools that leads to something more than a life of crime. I will tell you what we utilize in the local communities: the access to mental health, the reducing recidivism, criminal recidivism, improving the long-term mental health recovery and community reintegration, reducing jail time, and resolving, in the instance of local government, felony charges related primarily to mental health. So, one, there are a lot of veterans. Two, they have unique circumstances. And three, I think part of it, not to ignore the crime that was committed, is an idea of restoration and to end the recidivism. So you've got a combat veteran in your court, may not get the attention with a heavy docket that would allow them to get services and to stop the recidivism and to get their life equal to the service that they gave to their nation.
Reclaiming my time, I understand that, but different veterans, of course, have different experiences. There's a big difference. I'm reclaiming my time.
Would the gentleman yield?
In just a moment, I'd like to respond to what was said. Different veterans have different experiences. A big difference between being in a typing pool at the Pentagon and being in combat in Afghanistan. Furthermore, I think that many first responders would claim traumatic injuries from the psychological injuries from the terrible disasters that they've had to confront. From what we've heard from this committee, transgender people complain of great pressures on them. Now, a judge and a jury will take into account all of these differences without having to set up separate courts that take us away from the concept that we are all subject to the same law and to the same court
Would the
system.
gentleman yield now?
And I'll be happy to yield.
Thank you. It's an interesting question, but it's not the question for this bill, frankly. Those courts are already set up. This bill does not establish any new courts. What this bill does is to set up best practices to disseminate among the different states experiences in different kinds of services that help veterans in these courts.
Which is exactly my point. It is a slippery slope. We're already proceeding down. This bill would continue us down that slope by encouraging this practice, and I'm just not sure we've thought it through.
Gentleman yields back. Any further discussion? Reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 886 favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 835, the Rodchenkov Anti Doping Act of 2019, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 835 to impose criminal sanctions on certain persons involved in international doping fraud conspiracies to provide restitution for victims of
Without
such
objection,
conspiracies.
the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 835, the Rodchenkov Anti Doping Act of 2019, would strengthen the integrity of international sports competitions by imposing criminal sanctions to certain persons involved in international doping fraud conspiracies. It would also provide restitution for victims of such conspiracies and would require coordination and sharing of information with the United States Anti-Doping Agency to assist its fight against doping. The widespread use of performance-enhancing substances has come to light in recent years, harming athletes and fans alike. Clean U.S. athletes and sports organizations who participate in these competitions, as well as their U.S. sponsors, are denied their due recognition and economic rewards. And their fans lose when the legitimacy and integrity of the competitions they enjoy are debased. In recent years, there have been numerous allegations and instances of doping by professional and amateur athletes. The Summer and Winter Olympic Games in particular have been plagued with doping scandals, which has left an indelible stain on the reputation of these major international sports events. The infamous Russian doping scandal during the 2014 Sochi Winter Olympics is one notable example of the corruption and fraud that has damaged the integrity of sports competitions. After the Sochi Games, whistleblowers Yulia Stepanova, a former Russian track star, and her husband Vitaly Stepanov, a former employee at the Russian Anti-Doping Agency, exposed the Russian government's vast state-sponsored doping system, which subsequently led to further revelations by Dr. Grigory Rodchenkov, the chemist who ran the Russian anti-doping laboratory. Dr. Rodchenkov became a whistleblower and exposed the dozens of Russian athletes participating in the Sochi Games, including 15 medal winners who were part of the state-run doping program. In addition, Dr. Rodchenkov revealed that with the help of Russian intelligence, the laboratory switched steroid-tainted urine of the Russian national team with clean samples evading positive detection. The ineffective response from international organizations with oversight responsibilities, such as the World Anti-Doping Agency, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and the International Olympic Committee, has only emboldened the Russian government. Although Russia has denied its involvement, evidence shows that it operated a systematic state-sponsored doping program and cover-up scheme. Russia has cheated and defrauded all the Olympic athletes, including its own, and the general public, and has degraded the meaning and purpose of the Games. Unfortunately, because the orchestrators of the Russian doping scandal operated with the blessing of the Russian government, and because there's no legal mechanism in the United States to bring them to justice, they all escape punishment for their actions. Currently, there is no federal statute that provides explicit comprehensive protection against doping conspiracies in international sports competitions. The federal statutory protections that currently exist are limited and criminalize activities such as conspiracies to commit wire and mail fraud, bribery, kickbacks, and money laundering. This legislation would fill that gap by establishing appropriate criminal penalties and civil remedies for international doping fraud. In addition to imposing criminal penalties on the conspirators, the bill would authorize private civil actions for doping fraud, which would give athletes and corporate sponsors the right to sue in federal court to recover damages from individuals who may have defrauded competitors. This bill would provide justice to clean U.S. athletes such as Olympic runner Alicia Montano, skeleton racer Katie Eulander, bobsledder Steve Holcomb, and many other champions who pursue excellence over glory. They have been denied medals that were rightfully theirs and cheated out of lucrative opportunities such as sponsorships. Most importantly, they have been deprived of the pride of seeing their country's flag being raised on the Olympics podium, an emotional moment that was stolen from them. In the case of Mr. Holcomb, his bobsled team's bronze medals were upgraded to silver in the spring of 2019 after the Russian teams were disqualified for doping offenses during the 2014 Sochi Games. Tragically, Mr. Holcomb was not here to see it, having died in 2017. This bill also would provide much-needed protection and support for brave whistleblowers such as Dr. Rodchenkov and the Stepanovas, who have exposed major international doping fraud conspiracies at considerable personal risk and sacrifice. The exposure of this criminal activity would not have occurred without the courage and strength of these individuals. This bipartisan bill before us today would fill an important gap with regard to U.S. law enforcement. It would also serve as a deterrent to those considering engaging in doping fraud conspiracies and would provide a portal to gain visibility into a wider net of international corrupt practices that are connected to doping fraud. I thank our colleague, Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee, for introducing this important legislation. I strongly support H.R. 835. and I ask that my colleagues do the same. I now recognize the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll have a statement for the record. I'll agree with the assessment of the chairman so far. This is something we need to do. It's a good suspension bill, and I yield back.
I thank you, Mr. Collins. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. Is anyone who wishes to be recognized on this bill? The gentlelady, for what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
I'd like to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so very much, and I want to thank my co-sponsor, Dr. Burgess, and the other bipartisan co-sponsors on this important legislation. The Rodchenkov Anti Doping Act of 2019 is an important statement for the support and empowerment of international sports. The proliferation of illegal performance-enhancing drugs in sports damages the integrity of competition and defrauds individuals and corporate entities who participate in sporting competitions, including clean U.S. athletes and U.S. corporate sponsors. The complex inner workings of large-scale doping schemes are publicly known, due in large part to brave whistleblowers. In 2016, the head of the Russian effort exposed the Russian state-sponsored doping scandal that took place during the 2014 Sochi Olympics. By deceiving international anti-doping authorities and swapping athletes' samples, Russian officials cheated U.S. athletes out of Olympic glory and U.S. corporations out of honest sponsorships. These corrupt officials used bribes and illicit payments, sometimes through U.S. financial institutions, to commit this fraud. The masterminds behind the operation escaped any punitive repercussions for their actions because there was no legal arm to bring them to justice in the U.S. courts. To ensure that victims of doping fraud receive the justice, we introduced the RADA Act. Specifically, the bill establishes criminal penalties for knowingly manufacturing, distributing, and using PEDs. This section applies to all major international competitions in which U.S. athletes or U.S. entities participate, so that international fraud against Americans will not go unpunished. Establish a private civil right of action for doping, giving clean athletes and defrauded corporations and entities the opportunity to pursue civil action against deceptive competition and protect whistleblowers from retaliation to ensure that intimidation tactics will not be tolerated against those who do the right thing and expose fraudulent schemes. The exposure of this fraud was subject to enormous abuse in Russia and sought help from everyone outside of Russia, including the Helsinki Commission, which he testified in front of in the last year. Whistleblowers will also have a private right of action if they receive injuries for their exposure. This act comes at a crucial time for the international fight against doping in sport and is supported by the U.S. Helsinki Commission. The Russian doping fraud scandal shook the very foundations of the global anti-doping system, and the problems show no sign of stopping. Most recently, at the Nordic World Ski Championships, yet another doping ring was uncovered. Greater deterrents are needed. The ultimate victims of doping fraud are clean athletes and also those who love and view the competition. There are countless examples of U.S. athletes who've been defrauded by international dope frauds. These athletes are deprived of Olympic glory, which they worked many years from. Just 2 days ago, on October 14, 2019, the New York Times reported that, as suspected, Russia made thousands of changes to the drug test results of an unspecified number of its athletes. The head of the country's own anti-doping agency said this week, confirming the suspicions of global officials who are considering severe penalties against Russian sports programs. Finally, this act is fully compatible with the UNESCO Convention Against Doping in Sport and the World Anti-Doping Code, greatly enhances the fight against doping by creating additional legal tools to help guard against the type of behavior discovered in the Russian doping scandal. By criminalizing international doping conspiracies, the act provides at least some comfort and law enforcement with a greater ability to investigate, pursue, and ultimately hold accountable doping fraud perpetrators. Let me thank, as well as protecting the whistleblowers, the same protections as in other serious crimes. But let me thank, again, the leadership of the committee and the staff for working so diligently to help this bill come forward. I ask my colleagues to support this bill.
Gentlelady yields back.
I yield back.
Gentlelady The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support this anti-doping legislation, and I believe it builds on the good work that this committee did in the 115th Congress to advance legislation to protect Olympians from sexual violence and sexual assault. You will recall that when we learned of the horrors that many gymnasts faced, we passed legislation to ensure that coaches were not just shuffled around. That was an interesting day for me in the Judiciary Committee because it was a unanimously supported bill. There was no opposition, and yet we debated the bill for hours because since it referenced the Olympics, my colleagues then in the minority from the Democrat side chose to make the hearing about the now debunked Russia hoax. And so it seems only appropriate in discussion of this that I might be able to raise some questions, concerns, and maybe a grievance or two about the current Ukraine sequel to the Russia hoax that we are dealing with. Mr. Chairman, it was this week that following the instruction and the words that you had given about our committee's participation and involvement in the impeachment inquiry, that I sought to participate in the questioning and at least observe the questioning that was done by the House Intelligence Committee. And I based that on your words, Mr. Chairman. It was Thursday, September 12th, 2019, that you said, this committee, and by this committee, I assume you meant the Judiciary Committee, which you lead and which I serve on, this committee is engaged in an investigation that will allow us to determine whether to recommend articles of impeachment with respect to President Trump. Some call this process an impeachment inquiry. Some call it an impeachment investigation. There is no legal difference between these terms, and I no longer care to argue about the nomenclature. I took the chairman at his word that when he said this committee was engaged in an investigation, that this committee would, be able to participate in it. It was some days later, following the statement by the chairman, that the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, endorsed an impeachment inquiry into the President of the United States. I guess now I'm a bit flummoxed because seeking only to be involved in a process that could potentially overturn the results of an election, that could potentially be really a slap in the face to the American people who voted for and elected President Trump, I at least wanted to know what questions were being asked and what answers were being provided, being that the investigation was launched in this committee. I also take some note of history. During modern history, it has been the Judiciary Committee that is largely engaged in the impeachment process and undertaken that labor. Now, I know there are other circumstances where select committees have been established, and in fact, there are rules for select committees that would allow all members of the House to observe the proceedings of a select committee. It appears that Speaker Pelosi has reshuffled, I should say, the legislative deck to try to obtain an outcome that she could not obtain in this committee. It's noteworthy that after, more than a year of the current Democratic majority, not much had been accomplished in this committee to increase the fervor for impeachment in our country. When Robert Mueller was brought forward, many said that it would be a watershed moment. It would lead everyone to clamor for impeachment. The reality was it was sort of a nothing burger. It was a dud of a hearing, and if anything, the American people were concerned that Robert Mueller didn't view the Russian and Ukrainian efforts to pollute our elections with misinformation as within his purview, despite the fact that he'd been given this broad authority to observe and analyze potential election interference. And so I guess the question is, if Russian and Ukrainian efforts to lie about our president and pollute the electorate aren't in the purview of Robert Mueller, and if the investigation launched by this committee is no longer in the purview of this committee, what are we to think about our role moving forward? And will the chairman, on behalf of all members of the committee, in the majority and in the majority, on behalf of the rich history of the Judiciary Committee, on behalf of the historical significance of, I believe, this being the oldest committee in the Congress, will the chairman attempt to re-legitimize the work of the Judiciary Committee and insist that since it is the Judiciary Committee that has jurisdiction over impeachment, that we might at least be allowed to observe the proceedings? I ask the question in all due respect, and I would yield to the chairman if he would care to offer a thought.
Does the gentleman yield back?
Yes, sir.
Gentleman yields back. Are there any amendments to the bill?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlelady from Texas is recognized. The clerk will report her amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 835, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee. Page 2, strike line 4 of all the follows through line 14.
Considered as read. Ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, the gentlelady is recognized in support of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer this technical amendment to H.R. 835, which will first remove the findings section in the underlying bill. We will include the relevant information in the committee's report, but this will streamline the bill to focus on the substance of the offense. Second, the amendment enhances the definition of major international sport competition to now include those that are governed by the anti-doping rules and principles of the World Anti-Doping Code. Third, the amendment further clarifies that any property used or intended to be used in the commission of the specified offense herein may be criminally forfeited to the United States and provides more specificity for these procedures. And lastly, this amendment will allow for the information sharing between the United States and the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency as outlined in this bill, except in cases where the integrity of a criminal investigation would be affected. The amendment strengthens this bill, and I ask my colleagues to support it. In the concluding remarks, I do want to emphasize what Chairman Nadler said, and that I mentioned, and that is America loves her sports. She loves her athletes, professional and amateur. The Olympics is one of the most unifying and nationalistic, in a good way, efforts at supporting our outstanding young people. Our young people work for years of sacrifice by their families to get where they are, only to be confronted by something as dastardly as a doping scandal. So I ask my colleagues to think of that as they support this bill. And Mr. Chairman, I would be remiss if I did not celebrate the greatest athlete, I'm told by the history books, in the history of the United States Olympics, and that is my constituent, Simone Biles. I want to congratulate Simone. It is amazing what she did, and I wish her the very best. She is an example of American patriotism and leadership and championship that all can follow and admire. I ask my colleagues to support the underlying bill. I yield back.
The amendment. And the amendment, I say.
And the amendment. And the amendment.
Gentlelady yields back. I recognize myself to strike the last word. I rise in support of the Jackson Lee Amendment. This amendment makes several helpful changes to the underlying legislation and makes a good bill even better. I appreciate the leadership of the gentlewoman from Texas on this important legislation, and I urge all members to support the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time. Does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? The gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I hate to be a fly in the ointment. Once again, I'm sympathetic with the objective of the bill, but I have to ask, do we really want the government to begin regulating and criminalizing private sports? I mean, all sports competitions have their own governing boards and their own governing structures to establish and enforce rules within their sports to assure fairness. In some cases, different federations form over the same sport to accommodate different viewpoints on that sport, and that's as it should be. We already have civil and criminal laws that protect against damage due to willful fraud, but it's not clear to me that we should be imposing legal sanctions and would have always been private associations and private accommodations. I mean, are we next going to impose laws to protect against bad calls by umpires or designate how big a tennis court should be or how much rain can cancel a game? Once again, I think we're moving into a completely new field that government is neither intended nor is able to deal with justly. I think this is something we ought to be leaving to the private association.
Would the gentleman yield?
Of course.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. This bill essentially gives extraterritorial effect to the normal intent of our fraud laws. What we have here in the doping stuff are people committing fraud under state aegis sometimes, but people committing fraud and defrauding Americans and others, but Americans in this instance, of their rightful recognition, of commercial opportunities, and all sorts of things that flow from that. This simply is allowing the application of our fraud, or the equivalent of our fraud laws, where something has extraterritorial origin. So I don't think it really understands the matter to say that we're establishing a new body of law. We're simply saying when you commit fraud of this nature, we need to extend the government's authority to deal with that fraud. I yield back. I thank the gentleman. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I yield back.
Reclaiming my time, I just have to wonder, don't our current fraud laws already assure that? And how can the federal government assert jurisdiction over fraud committed in other countries beyond our jurisdiction?
The gentlelady from Texas.
I thank the gentleman for his concern. We're exerting jurisdiction over U.S. citizens who have been impacted by the doping scandal. That's what happened to our athletes. They then will have a right of action in our U.S. courts that can be proven that they have been, in essence, violated, offended, the laws have been broken. So we're giving our U.S. citizens their day in court. And I do think that we can agree that that is appropriate for the enormous damage that doping does around the world. And we have found, unfortunately, those occurrences in the United States as well. So I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady yields back. The question occurs on the amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Are there any further amendments to H.R. 835? Seeing none and reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 35 as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 4258, the Reauthorizing Security for Supreme Court Justices Act of 2019, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 4258, to authorize the Marshal of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court Police to protect the justices, employees,
Without
and official
objection, the bill is
guests.
considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 4258 would permanently authorize the Marshal of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court Police to provide protection for justices, Supreme Court officers and employees, and official guests outside the grounds of the Supreme Court building, including internationally. Under current law, the Marshal of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court Police are authorized to provide protection only in any state, unquote, and that authority expires at the end of this year. Permanent authority will allow for long-term management of protective activities and remove the threat of disruptions and security gaps caused by having an authority that periodically expires. In addition, the bill will provide parity between the Supreme Court Police and the Capitol Police and Secret Service, which both have permanent authority to protect senators, members of the House leadership, and the President, both domestically and internationally, instead of being limited to protection only in any state. This is unfortunately a period of increasing threats against our federal judges, and this legislation will help protect the justices of the Supreme Court, as well as the men and women the justices depend on to keep the court running. I applaud our colleagues, Representatives Greg Stanton and Greg Stubbe, for sponsoring H.R. 4258, which is supported by the Supreme Court, and I urge all members of the committee to support this legislation. I would now recognize Mr. Collins, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, but I recognize will admit his statement into the record. Without objection, all further opening statements will be included in the record. Are there any amendments to H.R. 4258? Does anyone wish to be? Who? For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you noted, since 1982, the Supreme Court Police has had permanent authority to protect the justices on the court's ground. However, the authority to protect them outside the grounds is temporary and has needed to be reauthorized every few years, most recently in 2013. The current authorization is set to expire on December 29th of this year. Given that deadline and the fact that potential threats against the justices have increased in recent years, I'm happy to see Judiciary Committee markup H.R. 4258, a bipartisan bill that will provide permanent authority to protect the justices outside of the Supreme Court grounds. Permanent authority will allow for the long-term management of protective activities and remove the threat of disruptions and security gaps caused by temporary authority. Supreme Court justices sit on the bench of the highest court in the land, and like members of the House leadership, senators, and the President, They should always be protected regardless of where they happen to be. And I want to thank Congressman Stubbe for joining me in support of the legislation. I hope to see H.R. 4258 move to the House floor as swiftly as possible. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentleman from Florida, for what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Today, I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 4258, the Reauthorizing Security for Supreme Court Justices Act of 2019. I'm proud to be the lead Republican co-sponsor of this vital legislation to permanently authorize the Marshal of the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court Police to provide protection for justices, Supreme Court officers, and employees and official guests outside the grounds of the Supreme Court building, including internationally. Much like threats against lawmakers, threats against Supreme Court justices have increased in recent years and are on track to exceed a record-breaking number reported in 2018. We must do our part here in Congress to ensure that our Supreme Court justices receive adequate protection. Current law authorizes Supreme Court police to protect justices. However, the authority to protect them outside of Supreme Court grounds is temporary and set to expire at the end of this year. This bill would allow for permanent authority and ensure long-term management of protective activities and remove the threat of disruptions and security gaps. It also clarifies that protection for the justices outside of the United States is included should the need arise. For decades, Congress has renewed the Supreme Court Police's authority to offer protections off grounds in a bipartisan manner. Most recently, in 2013, this bipartisan bill would continue our long history of protecting those who have committed their lives to public service in our nation's high court. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I thank my Democratic colleague. It's the Greg and Greg bill on here. I thank my Democratic colleague and working together to ensure that our justices in the Supreme Court are protected, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. A reporting quorum being present. The question is on the motion to report the Greg and Greg bill, H.R. 4258, favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 3713 to amend Title 28 United States Code, provide an additional place for holding court for the Western District of Washington and for other purposes. For purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 3713 to amend Title 28 United States Code, provide an additional place for holding court for the Western District of Washington and for
Without
other
objection,
purposes.
the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 3713 would amend current law to add Mount Vernon as a location where court shall be held in the Western District of Washington. The bill would substantially reduce the time to travel to Federal Central Violations Bureau proceedings, which handles tickets issued on federal property and payments for petty offenses committed on federal property for residents of Skagit Island and Snohomish counties. H.R. 3713 is supported by the judges, the United States Attorney, and the Federal Public Defender of the Western District of Washington, the U.S. Marshal Service, the Skagit County Bar Association, and the Whatcom County Bar Association. I applaud Representatives Susan Delbene and Rick Larson for sponsoring this bill and for working with the Chief Judge of the Western District of Washington to ensure that the bill reflects the input and support of a wide range of stakeholders, including the federal defender. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3713. The gentleman from Georgia, the ranking member of the committee, will submit his statement for the record, and it is admitted to the record. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. Does anyone seek recognition on this bill? For what purpose does the gentlelady from Texas seek recognition?
I strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Let me indicate, Mr. Chairman, that our work is important as it relates to courts, and I'm glad we've had the opportunity to address a number of these bills dealing with the courts, from the security question to the holding of court proceedings and working with the Eastern District of Arkansas. As I say that, let me also make mention of H.R. 3942. I was detained to express my support for the online sale of e-cigarettes, the preventing of online sale of e-cigarettes, and commend the sponsor, Rosa DeLauro, and indicate that it is clear that e-cigarettes use among youth and young adults is a public health concern, and it's important that the Judiciary Committee is working on all of these important bills, and particularly that one, and I ask support for the underlying bill, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 3713 favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. Pursuant to notice, I now call up the last bill of the morning, H.R. 1123, the Divisional Realignment for the Eastern District of Arkansas Act of 2019, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1123, to amend Title 28 United States Code to modify the composition of the Eastern Judicial District of Arkansas and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I will begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. H.R. 1123 would amend current law to reduce the number of operating divisions in the Eastern District of Arkansas from 5 to 3. The bill was prompted by the closure in 2017 of the only federal courthouses in 2 of the divisions. The 3 new divisions created by H.R. 1123 would align with the 3 remaining courthouses in that district. The new divisional lines are based on caseload history and travel times to the remaining courthouses. H.R. 1123 is supported by the Judicial Conference, the Judicial Council of the United States Court of Appeals for the 8th Circuit, and the Chief Judge of the Eastern District of Arkansas. I thank Representative Rick Crawford for sponsoring H.R. 1123, which is co-sponsored by the entire Arkansas House delegation, and I urge my colleagues to support this legislation. The statement for the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, will be submitted for the record. Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. Does anyone seek recognition on this bill? A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 1123 favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. This concludes our business for today. I think this is the earliest we have ever finished in this session. Thanks to all of our members for attending. Without objection, the markup is adjourned.